Hi friends, welcome back to class. I want to introduce Module 3. Module 3 may give some folks some difficulties because this is the one module where we're going to take a deep dive into historical criticism. Yeah, we've done some of the historical background in the previous modules, looked at things like the date of the Exodus and such, but this is the one module where we're going to go into the weeds on source criticism, which oftentimes trouble students from its implications. You may or may not have had this covered heavily in your OT 520 class, so I do want to say a couple of things about it. I'm also going to post a quick video if you're not familiar with the JEDP theory. And again, let me be clear, I'm not asking anyone to accept it, but we do want to study it. It's really critical that you get a sense of where scholars who take different perspectives, and perhaps you have, where they're coming from. And also you will have folks in your congregations who may hear things, may read something, and they have a question, and they just simply want to know how they can integrate some of the challenges that historical criticism presents with the things that we find in Scripture. Now let me talk about the assignment. We're going to do another grammatical analysis this week. This time it's on Exodus 6:3, which is critical in this whole source critical question. But for our main project, I'm going to have you look at the sources and compare contrast module 3, Exodus 3 and roughly Exodus 6, or roughly Exodus 3:1 to 4:17 and Exodus 6:2 to the end. These are two places where God does two things. He is authorizing Moses for ministry, and also in both places we have the revelation of the name Yahweh. So this is one of those places where historical critics, where source critics, would have called this a doublet, meaning that this isn't really two different calls of Moses, but in fact it's the same call reported slightly differently in two different sources that undergird or that sit behind the final form of the Pentateuch. So if you don't know much about source criticism, you're going to be looking at the essay Source Criticism in the Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch. And I'm also supplying you with Martin Notes breakdown of these chapters. And what you're going to notice that chapters 3 and 4 are a combination of J and E. And chapter 6 is the so-called priestly source. Now, I'm not asking you to become source critics, but what I am asking you to do is follow the instructions and do a comparison contrast and make an argument one way or the other, whether these are two distinct callings of Moses, or rather these are really a doubled or two different versions of the same call, and also think about how this fits into the final form of the book of Exodus. Now, let me give you two models that have always helped me when I think about historical criticism, and I would suggest sharing these with folks in the future because, again, we live in an age where you can find anything online. There's all kinds of documentaries, and a lot of things that we find online are people directly trying to challenge the faith of others or challenge belief in Scripture, and we just want to help our folks to be prepared to answer. So let me show you two models. If you had me for Old Testament introduction, you would have heard one of these. One of these goes back to my time myself when I was a student at Asbury. I had Dr. Lawson Stone, who still teaches in Wilmore, and he used this model. He called this the Christological analogy to think about Scripture. In other words, if I asked you how much of the Bible was human and how much of it was divine, sometimes the temptation is to say, well, it's half human, half divine, or something like that, right? Or the idea is if I could say that humans had a major contribution here, the idea is if whatever we say that humans did, that takes away what God did, okay? What Dr. Stone said is, now that's not the way to think about it. You can investigate the human processes behind where we got the Bible. That's what historical criticism does. So you can argue that the Bible is 100% human, but what that doesn't mean then is that it squeezes out God out of this, because we can also say that the Bible is 100% inspired. So kind of like on that analogy of how we think about Jesus. is both 100% God, 100% human, we can see the overlap. Again, I'd call that the Christological analogy. And if you find that helpful, I would invite you to share with other people. Again, it's the idea the Bible can be fully inspired and fully written by human authors, right? So that's historical criticism. Now, the second one, this comes from N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright, when he talks about the relationship between faith and history, he takes a house, and this house has an attic, and it has a basement. And when we think about faith and we think about history, sometimes we see these things in tension as well. Sorry, my camera is not focusing too well there. See if I can get it to come back into focus. Come on. I'm not sure why it's not auto-focusing there. There it is. All right, sorry about that. So when we talk about faith and history, oftentimes that's a dichotomy. And a lot of us to choose, we're going to live up in faith, right? And you might want to say, another thing that you can say is one of my favorite sayings is Paul Tillich talked about the role of theology. He said a theologian stands between superstition and pure scientism, right? And this isn't the same as the house, right? So how do we stake out that place, right? Faith is required, right? But if you only live in the realm of faith, like I'm going to believe something no matter what, there's no evidence to the contrary, well, that's like living in the attic of your house, right? Attics aren't bad, but probably rather live in the nice part of the house. Now, if you say that I'm not going to believe anything unless I can be 100% certain and able to prove it using modern scientific methods, that's like living in the basement, okay? So how do we put these two things together, faith and history? Well, we want to have a faith, we want to have a believing faith. We want to have that's rooted in our understanding of history. And so what we need is instead of living in the attic, we need to listen to history and hear the hard questions that historical scholarship can make to faith, right? But it works the other way around too. When you just have these critically assured minimums, the certainty, we got to let faith speak into that as well. So it's a dialogue where faith brings questions to history, and that lets us then what? Live in the house. So I hope that helps. By the way, keep working on the Hebrew. Remember, just learn a couple of new things each day, each week, and I'll continue and I'll get you some feedback, and we'll continue to learn and get better at Hebrew as we go along. Again, if you have other questions, please reach out. It's my absolute privilege to be your professor.